name is Jeremy Brown. My paper here today is Old Things New, the Modern Textus Receptus of Ethiopic Jonah. This comes out of my dissertation at Catholic University of America, where I've looked at 129 of the 130 known manuscripts of Ethiopic Jonah, and I've prepared critical editions of the 5 text types of the transmission history of Jonah. And we're going to zoom in today on the Modern Textus Receptus. And I'd like to think this is well timed with the Accordance module coming out soon of the Ethiopic Bible, which is a copy of the Modern Textus Receptus. So my hope is that this presentation will give us a little bit of an idea of the editorial method that was carried out to produce that edition. So first, so that we have a common ground of understanding the transmission history of Ethiopic Jonah, this is how I've envisioned it, coming from the Greek Vorlage to the Oxumite Bible. The revision that Martin talked about that we can't get in front of, I've called Alpha here, producing the earliest attested 1, and then Beta, which becomes the earliest attested 2, which Theod is often called the transitional text, which then is revised into the standardized version and then revised to the Textus Receptus, and then a outlier tradition of the Latin Vorlage manuscripts. So the first question to be asked in the 19th and 20th century, when the Textus Receptus rises in popularity and then takes hold of the tradition, is what earlier text types continue to be copied? First, the earliest attested 1 does continue to be copied. This text is most common in the 14th, 15th century, but in the 19th century we do have 2 witnesses. We also have 3 witnesses from the earliest attested 1 outlier manuscripts. By outlier, I mean these are texts that it seems that the scribe had an earliest attested 1 exemplar in front of them, and then either had a second exemplar of a different text type, or they carried Bible in their head, and they create these hybrid versions. And so we have 3 examples of this from this time period where they seem to have had an earliest attested 1, but created something new. The earliest attested 2, which rises in the 15th and 16th century, does continue to be copied all the way into the 20th century. And this text type is revised into the standardized. Standardized rises in the 17th and has continued to be copied well into the 20th century. And that brings us to the Modern Textus Receptus. In my study, I found 11 witnesses to this text type. And this can be broken into 2 stages. An early stage, stage 1, comes from the 19th century. We have 2 manuscripts of this. This is a more conservative revision. It holds closer to the standardized text, but is clearly different from the standardized. We have a transitional text coming from Menelik Scriptorium at Audus Alum, and then a stage 2 that arises in the 20th century, in which they take another further step away from the standardized text type. So now I'd like to take us on a bit of a tour of the editorial method that's used by the Textus Receptus. So the first editorial method is follow the standardized against the earliest attested 2. I have tracked 14 readings in which the standardized text is different from the earliest attested 2 across all the witnesses of those 2 text types. In 8 of these 14 readings, the Textus Receptus follows the standardized. Here we can see that in the earliest attested 2, we have a negative imperative, which it comes from the Greek, and it's also found in the Hebrew and the Arabic. But the standardized and subsequently the Textus Receptus change this away from the negative imperative to a result clause. A second example comes up in Jonah 4:2, in which the earlier text types say that Jonah prayed to God, where the standardized expands this to, and he prayed to God, the Lord, or his Lord. It seems that the standardized is characterized by liturgical expansion. You get extra credit if the text is a little bit longer in the standardized for the scribes. This seems to be coming probably from the Psalter. We see, for example, Psalm 67, verse 20, blessed be God the Lord. So one possible example of liturgical expansion. And this expansion is not motivated by the Greek, the Hebrew, or the Arabic. We have one example of an editorial method in which the Textus Receptus follows the earliest attested 2 against the standardized, but only in the 19th century stage 1 of the text type. Going into stage 2, they walk away from this and just adopt the standardized text. So the initial verb in this, taba'asu, they exerted themselves, very close to the Greek, and to the verb found in the Arabic. The standardized goes with fakadu, they wanted. It removes some of the ambiguities and the wider semantic range of the earlier verb, but in doing so, they've moved away from their vorlage. But the 19th century witnesses to the Textus Receptus follow the verb that's closer to the vorlage, whereas the 20th century have adopted the clearer but further away reading. Perhaps one of the most interesting is the editorial method of blending and conflating readings. By blending, I mean that the scribe takes the first half of a verse from one text type, the second half of the verb from another text type, and creates a new form of the verb, or verse. And then conflation, they take reading 1, reading 2, set them side by side, and include both readings. So here we have an example of conflation in Jonah 1:9. Jonas, and Jonah said to them, I am a servant of God, coming from Greek, doulos kurio. The standardized adopts Weguelomu Ibrawiana, and he said to them, I am a Hebrew, coming from the Arabic. Ivrani, tracing all the way back to the Hebrew Ivri. The Textus Receptus takes both readings to be Gabrek Ziabaherana Ibrawi, I am a servant of God, a Hebrew. An example of blending is found in Jonah 3:8. So here we see the use of the perfect verb, put on, and we have two subjects, men and livestock. The standardized changes to adjussive and only has one subject of the verb. The Textus Receptus, like the change to the adjussive, it does move the text closer to the Arabic vorlage, but it went back to the earliest attested to and got the second subject of the verb. We see a number of examples of this. This occurs in 5 of the 14 distinctive readings where the standardized differs from the earliest attested to. We also see the clear influence of the 7th biblical canticle upon the standardized and the Textus Receptus. The standardized walks away from what had been transmitted in the biblical manuscripts and instead adopts the 7th biblical canticle text from the Ethiopic Psalter in Jonah 2:4 through 2:6. And the Textus Receptus follows this. So here we see the earliest attested to. It has a different initial verb. The 7th biblical canticle has a verb that moves a bit closer to the passive verb found in the Greek. But the earliest attested to, the second clause is clearly closer to the Greek, but the 7th biblical canticle has a translation that's further away, and the Textus Receptus follows the canticle. We also see a number of expansions that arise in this stage 2 20th century text type. They do one-word expansions quite often. In 16 of the 49 verses in the 20th century witnesses, they have small expansions to the text that are not motivated by external sources. So for example, Wakona Kala Haba Jonas, and the word of God came to Jonah. In the 20th century witnesses, they add Nabi, the prophet. This is probably coming through the traditional title of the book, so Jonas Nabi, and they've just imported it into verse 1. Second example comes up in Jonah 3:7, where the first verb in this passage does not have a direct object, but the second one does. So they shall not pasture and they shall not drink water. The 20th century witnesses want to balance that out. So they add a direct object onto the first verb, so they shall not pasture on grass and they shall not drink water. These are some of the examples of these 16 occurrences. They also use a call and compliance report literary technique in the 20th century, where when we get the verb azaza, to command, used from God, they tell us what God commanded and the subsequent response of the command did. So in the 4 occurrences in Jonah, this expansion occurs in 3 of the verses, Jonah 2:11, 4:6, and 4:8. They do not do it in Jonah 4:7, although one of these outlier witnesses to the earliest attested one does do the expansion, but only in that one verse. So I'm not sure what that scribe saw that brought him to that because it's a one-off, only in that one manuscript. So an example of that we see in Jonah 4:6, and God commanded a gourd, and it grew, and it shaded him over the head of Jonah. The 20th century witnesses expand and tell us what God commanded. So when God commanded a gourd, and then in red, the addition, to grow and to shade over the head of Jonah, and it grew and it shaded over the head of Jonah. We also see this in Jonah 4:8, where God commanded a wind of intense heat that burnt, and the 20th century witnesses tell us what God commanded and the wind's response. So God commanded a wind of intense heat that burnt to come, and it came. So these very nice little expansions. We also see some linguistic variation. It's clear that over the centuries, the use of ge'ez has shifted over time. Small things, syntactical structures, lexical choice. An example of this is all the witnesses of earliest attested 1, earliest attested 2, and the standardized use the preposition ba'enta, and in the Textus Receptus they switch to babina. Two prepositions, very close semantic value, but when you add it up over 103 witnesses, it becomes indicative that the language seems to be shifting. We also see that scribes like to make explicit what had been implicit. So here we see the addition of the interrogative particle, nu, which had not been attested until the Textus Receptus. This is likely a scribal feature, although it could be a feature of external revision, perhaps coming from an Arabic manuscript such as the Bodleian Arabic Christian Uri 6, which does use kaifa, the interrogative how. And then final technique is revision towards external sources. It's better to understand the Textus Receptus as looking back at the Ethiopic tradition, making revisions internally, and then putting forth a version of the text that represents the tradition. This is somewhat different from the earliest attested 2, which is appealing to external sources, and especially to the standardized, which appeals quite a bit to external sources, most likely an Arabic translation, Peshitta, for Jonah. However, we do have 2 examples in the Textus Receptus of Jonah that suggest that they had an external source that they appealed to. So in Jonah 4:5, we see that the noun Hagar is translated as the subject of the verb until he would see what the city would become. And in the 20th century witnesses, this is changed to Hagar appearing in a prepositional phrase until he would see what would take place in the city. This Bahagar in the city prepositional phrase moves it closer to the ethical dative of the Greek, as well as to the Ba'ir prepositional clause in the Hebrew or the Fil Medinati clause in Arabic. So it seems that it has an external source that it's moving towards. A second example comes in Jonah 4:11, and in the order of the hands as God is talking about the people of Nineveh. The verse is, who do not distinguish their left hand, segamomu, and their right hand, uyamanomu. In the earliest attested 1, earliest attested 2, and the standardized, it's always their left hand and their right. This is different from the Greek, which has right hand and left, as well as the Hebrew and the Arabic, which have right hand and left. In the 20th century witnesses, they do make the change to have right hand first and then left hand, suggesting that they had access to an external source that they were pulling closer to. And then an unexpected, long-lost reading that comes back around in the 20th century Textus Receptus. So the earliest attested 1 version of Jonah 2:8 is what Zakareikaewo La'exyaber Soba Halkat Nefsia La'aleya or En La'aleya. And with this prepositional phrase being the feature I want to talk about, upon me or from upon me. So in the earliest attested 2 and the standardized, they change the order of the clauses. The Soba clause comes first, and then the I remembered God clause comes second, moving it closer to the Greek. But they've dropped this prepositional phrase, which is translating Greek epoemu, from me. Interestingly, in the Textus Receptus, this prepositional phrase reappears. This cannot be explained by it using earliest attested 2 or the standardized, at least in the extant witnesses of the 84 witnesses to those two text types I looked at, and none of them had this prepositional phrase. So it seems that the scribes must have had access to an earliest attested one manuscript as they were creating the modern Textus Receptus. But we need additional data sets to see how much they did appeal back to this earliest form of the text rather than to the earliest attested to and standardized. So thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions.